Tanaya should start in a minute. Tanaya,
Okay.
I think we can start.
A very good afternoon to everyone. In pursuance of our endeavor to launch a new thought leadership series, Taxsutra Dialogues, where renowned legal and tax experts will share their views and insights on unfolding events, policy fallouts, and possible solutions, today is our inaugural edition where we will witness a riveting conversation with Queen's Counsel and renowned international tax expert Mr. Philip Baker on the discussion theme of Future of International Tax and Multilateralism in Uncertain Times. The discussions shall be moderated by tax expert Mr. Mukesh Bhutani and Taxsutra Group Editor Mr. Arun Giri. I would also like to take the opportunity to apprise you all that in the last 10 minutes of the webinar, our speakers will host a dedicated question and answer session. For this, you may post your queries in the chat box, which is located on the bottom right of your screen. Also requesting all participants to kindly keep their videos on mute. I now hand it over to Arun, sir.
Thanks so much, Tanaya. It's the first edition of the Unveiling Taxsutra Dialogues today. And what a guest we have, a special guest, Philip Baker, acclaimed international tax expert, barrister, quintessential British, someone who is not just a tax expert, not just a tax academician, but someone who's also, if I could say, a historian, someone who tells stories at bedtime, at night time, not only to his children who are no longer teenagers, but he can tell riveting stories to all of us. And he will, for the simple reason that we are living in times which we haven't seen before. Neither has Philip. The word COVID-19 will surely enter the Oxford Dictionary if it isn't there already. There is someone whom I've been reading about quite a lot over the last year and a half, ever since I traveled last to the US in November 2017. That person's name is Ray Dalio. He's authored a bestseller book called The Principles. Ray Dalio is the co-founder of one of the most successful hedge funds in the history of the world. It's now managing assets worth $60 billion. Ray Dalio is a sort of thinker that we see once in a generation. And in his book, The Principles, he keeps repeating one sentence: whatever you are seeing in the world today, whatever you're seeing in the world today, you've seen it in the past. All you have to do is go back to the past event, make connections, and you will have a better idea of how to respond to the crisis that is going to unfold. Well, that simple principle, if you may think it is simple, has served Ray Dalio so well that he's written complex algorithms that have not failed in the last 3 decades while predicting the economic and financial markets landscape. This time, though, was an exception. He too was not spared the financial markets fallout of COVID-19. He's written a 13,000-word essay. I have not read it in full. But one thing is very sure. Even now, a thinker like him is grappling with how is the world going to respond to the fallout of COVID-19. If there are certain events that have caused a seismic shift in the world in the last 70, 80 years, and I'm going to start with that question to Philip first. But if there are certain events, you could say World War II, maybe landing on the moon, maybe John F. Kennedy's assassination, the African Americans getting equal rights in the US. In India, you could look at an event like bank nationalization of 1969. We could look at the Keshwananda Bharti case, Gulf War. The global financial crisis of 2008 was the last big event which caused a disruption worldwide. But if there is one crisis that stood out in the last 100 years, of which maybe we can talk a little bit, is the Great Depression of the 1930s. It savaged the US economy. In a way, the US economy has not been savaged in the last 90 years. It ended the Herbert Hoover presidency. It brought in and not very well known, but two-term governor of New York to the US presidency called Franklin D. Roosevelt. He then embarked on what many called an experiment, the FDR New Deal. The New Deal, constructions, employment, 50% of banks in the US had failed, inspiring the US Americans to get back on their feet. It took him full 6 years to achieve what he set out. And the one statement among his several memorable quotes that stand out is, the only thing now left to fear is fear itself. I think when we are talking about COVID-19 and its responses, we will be talking of whether we will need a new deal like FDR did, which has catapulted him to among the greatest presidents ever that the US has seen. We will need not just political leadership, but what even today Americans call the moral leadership that FDR displayed, that maybe Winston Churchill displayed during World War II. To discuss some of these aspects, if you're going to have economic fallout, financial markets fallout, humanitarian fallout, you can't get someone better than Philip here. He is going to talk about tax, but this discussion is not just tax. It's going to be much more than tax, and I'm honored to be joined by my good friend, one of the top tax experts in India, a global tax policy expert, founder of BMR Legal. He wears two hats always, both a chartered accountant and a lawyer. That's a dangerous combination. Mukesh Bhai, his questions have the ability to trip Philip if they can. Philip, an absolute pleasure to be talking to you. And I am sure that everyone on this call, everyone who's watching you wants to hear from you. What is going to be the geopolitical fallout, the future of multilateralism, some of the big events that are coming this year, the Trump-Biden matchup, which has the ability to shake up, geopolitics, maybe a financial policy world over again. What are the chances of new taxes coming all across the world? What happens to digital tax? So many of these things that we want to discuss today, Philip, over the next 45 odd minutes. And in fact, we have a special guest today who will be posing some questions to you as well. Legal, constitutional scholar, and one of the top lawyers, not just in India, but in the world, Mr. Arvind Datar. A pleasure to be having him on this webinar. Thanks, Mukesh Bhai, for facilitating it. And we look forward to hearing from Mr. Datar, once we hear from Philip. Philip, my first question to you. When is it that you last saw a crisis which almost spooked you, which caused fear in you? May not be of this magnitude, but a crisis which you felt could shake the very foundation of our existence.
Aaron, that's an almost impossible question. I don't think I have ever seen in my lifetime events quite like those of the last couple of months. We're looking at a global crisis in terms of health and a virus spreading that is threatening across the world, and it's having massive economic impact. So the 2008 financial crisis, I remember that spooking me to a certain extent, but this spooks me even more. And of course, we're speaking at the moment at a time when we really don't know how the crisis, COVID, is going to play out. We don't know whether there's going to be a vaccine developed. We don't know whether the different measures that have been adopted in different countries are going to be effective. We don't know whether we're going to see a second bounce of the virus. We don't know how long it's going to be around for. The only, and this, I'm old, but I'm not this old, I can't remember it, but the only equivalent medical crisis of this nature was, well, the only one in the last century was the Spanish flu that spread around after the end of the, or the latter part of the First World War. That appears to have started in 1917. It was carried to the Western Front of the war in Europe in the earlier part of 1918, and raged amongst both armies there. It then seemed to die down during the summer of 1918, only to come back. It changed into a more virulent form in the latter part of 1918, just at the time that armies were traveling back from Europe to other parts of the world, and soldiers returning from the Western Front to Southern Africa, to India, to the Far East. They carried the virus with them, and the worst impact of the virus was actually felt when it arrived at places like Bombay and Calcutta and Cape Town. That's when the largest number of deaths took place. So at the moment, we're talking at a time when the virus is still playing out, and we don't know what the long-term effect will be. What we do know is that it's already having severe economic impact, and we can start thinking about what life, the tax life, may be like after COVID.
Let me come to that straight. And I'll bring in Mukesh Bhai as well in a few minutes. One of the big impact of this, Philip, is going to be the geopolitical fallout. What is the geopolitical fallout? People are already talking about ramifications. There are talks about ramifications for China. The U.S. political, elections, the U.S. presidential elections has heated up with the talk of, again, was China responsible, not responsible? Did the Trump administration completely abdicate its responsibility? This will have a larger geopolitical fallout as well, Philip. You're seeing it in Great Britain, where the British Prime Minister too was diagnosed as positive, COVID-19 positive, went to the hospital. It definitely, after that, spurred a much different response from the British government than it did before that. So there is going to be a huge geopolitical impact of COVID-19. How do you see possibly political leadership at the global level shifting either from US to somewhere else, or maybe China becoming a little less fancy a destination for some? How will this pan out at the G20 or at a larger political level, Philip?
Well, that's a massive series of questions, and I can only express some sort of personal views on these points. And in some respects, we don't know, as I said in response to your first question, what the long-term effect of the COVID virus is going to be. We are still in relatively early stages, and we don't know whether there's going to be a further round of the virus later this year. But in terms of its impact on global leadership, we've seen a number of things happening. We've seen the US pretty much abdicating any element of global leadership. It's not in President Trump's nature to be a global leader, to be an internationalist, and quite frankly, his standing internationally is probably in negative figures. So the likelihood that during his presidency, we're going to get any sort of global leadership with regard, for example, to the tax world coming out of the US is very small. At the same time, the European Union has not come out well from handling the crisis. There's been an immediate rush to national measures in Europe, countries closing their borders, countries seeking to protect their own medical services, a little bit of cooperation, but very largely a national response. And the role of the European institutions and the European Council has provided little leadership. It doesn't look as though they're going to be able to provide proposals with regard to the tax world. So far as China is concerned, China's in a difficult position here, isn't it? Because on the one hand, COVID seems to have originated in China. China seems to have got it under control at the moment fairly quickly and is providing assistance to other countries. And yet a number of questions remain. How transparent was China at the very beginning? could China have prevented the spread of the virus? Is China using the opportunity, for example, to clamp down on protests or potential protests in Hong Kong, on those who are critical of China in Hong Kong? China is both coming out quite well, but on the other hand, there are also some seriously unanswered questions. In any event, it's not been, I think, very much of the nature of China to provide leadership in an area like taxation. There isn't any sort of obvious ideology that one can see coming out of China that could lead on a tax response. So I find it actually very hard to see coming out of this crisis where we are going to be, we're going to see a leading country or a country that provides solutions. The UK, for example, you mentioned earlier how badly the UK government has responded to COVID. They responded too slowly. We have a whole series of measures. We're also at the same time still having to deal with the whole question of leaving the European Union. So I don't see the United Kingdom providing much leadership here. So we have something of a vacuum, no obvious global leader to provide, to sort of point a way for the future.
Mukesh Bhai, welcome to the Taxsutra Dialogues. Your first thoughts, Mukesh Bhai, and on especially the second question, the geopolitical fallout, Mukesh Bhai, and what impact it could have also on global tax policy formulation.
Yeah, Arun, if I may just prompt Philip, just
Sure.
to continue with his distinct. Philip, multilateralism in uncertain world and the future of international tax raises some very important questions in today's environment. If we compare, even remotely, the situation that the global economies are in today with the 2008 financial crisis, I felt that multilateralism truly played out, whether it played out because of the G7 or the G20 or the OECD. And it largely played out for the right reasons that you mentioned in the context of leadership that was provided at that point by the G20, led by the G7. And what we saw at that point in time was a set of coordinated efforts, whether those efforts were through finance ministers on tax policies or through central bank, central bankers through monetary policy. But there was some degree of coordination. Understandably, this is not a financial crisis, it is a health crisis. But since the health crisis is translating into deep economic crisis, most people believe that there is no one that provided leadership for coordinated action. Just take an instance of what's the headline today in Financial Times London. The Fed chief in the US has already started talking about the additional stimulus. However, the OECD Secretariat has cautioned that this is going to be a costly affair. Don't you see this to be an extreme case of chaos going, pretty against the grain and philosophy of multilateralism in these uncertain times?
Very, very good points, Mukesh. Two perhaps separate issues to distinguish there. First, we are in a very different situation, I think, from the 2008 financial crisis. Firstly, that was very specifically financial. It wasn't a crisis to the health and hospital systems around the world. This is a virus that we don't yet have a vaccine for, with a consequence of serious economic damage. And we don't have simply economic solutions. In 2008, there were economic solutions that could be used. We don't have those. And in any event, many national financial institutions are in a weakened position. Interest rates are virtually zero or even negative for some countries. There's relatively little that can be done in terms of easing the financial burden through the financial systems in many countries. So it's very different from that time. And also at that time, we did have some leadership, people like Gordon Brown, British Prime Minister, working with the European Union, working with the Americans, could come up with solutions. We said earlier, I don't see anybody in a position to provide that sort of leadership. The second question that you asked is this dilemma of multilateralism versus nationalism. We've seen in the first couple of months of the crisis a retreat in many countries to a very, very nationalistic response, closing borders, looking to safeguard medical supplies for the country, countries not really seeking to cooperate on this. On the other hand, this is a global crisis. It's something that doesn't stop at the borders, where we need to have countries cooperating to deal with the virus. We need support for the WHO, for example. Yet on the other hand, President Trump has temporarily restricted funding to the WHO. So I think there's, on the one hand, a recognition of the need for multilateral solutions to a global problem, and on the other hand, a tendency in many parts of the world to look purely within the borders of the country and look for purely nationalist solutions. And I'm certainly going to see that reflected in the tax world as well.
Philip, can I continue on that thread? I just want to just a natural extension of what Mukesh asked and what you just said, that this will spill over to the tax arena as well on the tax policy front. If you looked at the last 5-6 years, Philip, so many of us were skeptics on the BEPS front, whether OECD would be able to achieve a consensus. Yet they were able to achieve a broad consensus on the BEPS action plan, brought 90-100 countries on board, started to implement action plans, even though some countries may have shot the, may have jumped the gun on certain aspects like the digital tax. Yet there was a strong element of multilateral cooperation, multilateralism, bound together by the G20 in the last 10 to 11 years, ever since the Lehman collapse. And that brought a crisis. That was a crisis for the financial world, especially for the governments and tax collection. You are again back to square one when tax collections are concerned. But on the multilateralism front, do you think the sort of multilateral cooperation that we saw on the tax policy side globally over the last 5 to 6 years, you think there will be a pause on that, or it could be just a temporary pause or a reversal?
Again, hard to say because we're at an early stage with the playing out of the virus there. I think the OECD is in a very difficult position here. You can see from what they have done with regard to COVID, they are trying very, very hard to provide global leadership. So if you look at the OECD website, they've gathered together information about the measures that have been taken by national governments in response to COVID, delaying tax payments, providing relief for losses in companies, a whole series of measures that countries have taken individually to ease the burden for businesses and for taxpayers. So they're trying to do that. On the other hand, they don't really have a mandate to provide international tax leadership. They are not a general international tax organization. They have to operate through member countries. So they need the G20 to give them a mandate to go ahead for post-COVID tax solutions. And they don't really have that mandate at the present moment. Meanwhile, they are trying to continue with the agenda that they have been working on really since 2013, which is to continue the BEPS agenda and to try to come to solutions on the digital economy. There, they've got real difficulties because they've been trying to work towards a consensus. They were aiming for consensus, or at least an agreement in principle by June this year. That's been pushed back to October. Many of us think that that is really rather critical because a number of points arise. One of them is, is the world at the moment, the G20, the countries around the world, really that concerned with finding a solution to this issue, or are there other matters that ought to come higher on the agenda? But pushing an attempt to reach agreement by October runs the problem of the US electoral cycle. The US has a presidential election in November. It's very unlikely, even what we said earlier about the difficulty of the US providing leadership, it's going to be very hard to get any sort of agreement that involves bringing in the US in the latter half of this year. So June was probably the last time that an agreement could have been reached before the US became totally focused on the election. It makes it very difficult to see how they're going to get agreement on the digital economy for October. Much more likely that it gets pushed into next year. That may not be a bad thing, because next year we will know the uncertainty about the leadership in the US will be resolved. We will either have a second Trump presidency, or we will have a Democrat president. It will take a couple of months for a new president to settle in if it's a Democrat presidency, but then we may be in a different position to look at a global agreement. But getting global agreement by October seems to me to be a very difficult task.
Mukesh bhai, you want to?
Philip, short of saying that tax multilateralism is at a pause right now, you said everything. And then the next logical question is, does this give some form of a license to nations who already have been saying that tax is a sovereign subject to put a host of, either a host of unilateral measures, or to just go in different directions, whether it's got to do with their policies, treaties, or profit attribution rules, or dispute resolution process, everything. Do you see that risk being accentuated in the post-COVID world?
Well, there is certainly a very real probability that governments will be taking their own measures to deal with the post-COVID period. We've seen how governments have reacted by trying to ease the tax burden on businesses and taxpayers. But we can see huge amounts of debt building up by governments, both in terms of expenditure on hospitals and medical facilities, and also by deferring the collection of tax. Many businesses will not survive this crisis. Their tax receipts will not come in. Other businesses will have losses that will have the result that those businesses are not paying tax for some time to come. So tax receipts from traditional taxes are likely to be down, and governments must already begin looking at that and seeing how long can they sustain high levels of debt, and how are they going to bring down that debt, which has to be through tax receipts. I imagine many governments are beginning to consider the new taxes they might be introducing. For example, there's a little bit of a discussion coming around about excess profits taxes. Standing back for a moment, there are many businesses that are suffering very, very badly as a result of this crisis. On the other hand, there are some that are doing very well indeed. Businesses that are providing online video conferencing services, businesses that are providing deliveries of food and other products to people's doors. So on the one hand, whilst airlines and the tourist industry is doing very badly, other businesses are earning excess profits. When in the past we've had businesses that have profited, for example, during wartime, it's not been unusual to find quite high taxes being introduced on the supernormal profits, the profits that are in excess of those that would normally have been made by those businesses. So it wouldn't be surprising to me if we saw a number of governments considering excess profits taxes. It also wouldn't surprise me if a number of governments looked at the long-term question of the huge disparity of wealth within their countries. This is being perhaps made more apparent through the COVID crisis. The virus is hitting the poorer parts of the population much more heavily than wealthier families. In the UK, in the poorer parts of London, you are 3 times more likely to come down with COVID virus than you are in the wealthier parts. In the northern part of this country, which is generally less wealthy than the southeast, there are much higher rates of the virus in the population. I can see governments looking at measures like steeply progressive wealth taxes, for example, to pay for better medical facilities and to meet some of the costs of the medical emergency. So yes, I'm certain that there will be a number of national tax measures that are being considered by governments.
Yeah, Philip, and continuing on that thread, do you also see, just 2 quick questions as a follow-up. One, are you generally happy with the satisfied with the measures announced by the governments worldwide on how they are tackling it on the economic side, on the stimulus side, how each country is trying to revive the economy? Anything, any response you think that countries like India could emulate on the economic side, because there would be there are developed economies, there are developing countries like India, and then of course there are the really poorer nations who will struggle more, as you said. How would you categorize, how would you like each of these 3 parts, the developed nations, the developing countries like India, and the poorer countries? How do you think the responses might shape up? Because each of them would have different responses on the economic side.
Well, in terms of measures taken so far, it seems that many governments have been trying to ease the burden on their businesses and on the populations there, with many people losing employment, many businesses having no customers, being unable to open even, having to pay taxes at the time would be very difficult. So it's a short-term emergency measure of easing the payment of taxes. In the longer term, governments will have to encourage the right type of economic growth. Now, there must be a conflict there in governments between, on the one hand, trying to raise taxes in order to pay off the debts that are being incurred by them, and on the other hand, the danger that higher taxes stifle the growth of new businesses. One response of governments, and this may vary in different parts of the world, is to try to provide tax incentives for those areas of the economy where the government thinks they can benefit and grow very quickly and create new employment. The difficulty is that historically governments have been very poor in identifying the best areas for growth. Providing tax incentives, it sort of usually goes hand in hand with the higher the normal tax system, the more beneficial are tax incentives. And if you target those, you have to be very certain that you target them correctly. My personal view is that governments generally don't get that right, and it's better to have a lower general tax rate rather than a higher rate on businesses matched by special tax incentives. In terms of different parts of the world, we haven't yet really seen, it's been very strange, COVID. It's hit many of the wealthier countries hardest first. And that's why we're sitting talking here now. We don't know how badly it may hit the developing countries and the poorer countries in the world. It may not hit them at all. On the other hand, it may, like the Spanish influenza, be absolutely devastating when it finally comes. That's one of the things that really terrifies me, and does make me lie awake at night. What happens? We've seen what happened when COVID hit Italy and Spain and the UK and the US. But what happens if it really hits poorer countries to a large extent? One of the answers that may come out of it is that going forward, health and care in those countries must be a greater priority. And the tax systems worldwide have to be examined to make certain that funding is provided for those countries to develop their health care, and that the funds are actually used for that purpose. It's not just assisting those countries in collecting taxes, but also ensuring that the countries employ those funds for those purposes rather than the funds being lost through corruption or through expenditure on military or other purposes.
Yeah, I think Mukesh bhai, can I put a question to you?
Yes.
With regard to the Indian stimulus measures that have been announced yesterday, more will follow. But Mukesh bhai, the larger question is, you read the Bloomberg piece that came the other day that Indian Commerce Ministry is pushing the Finance Ministry to announce or is considering that there must be a tax exemption for foreign direct investment over $500 million, $100 million, announce a 10-year tax holiday, and so on and so forth. Are you going to see another wave of tax incentives and tax exemptions? And therefore, you are again, in a way, back to the pre-BEPS era of tax competition, Mukesh bhai?
I don't know. I mean, if I say anything, it could sound speculative, but I will give you my personal views. If you look at yesterday's announcements, I don't consider that as a fiscal stimulus. I consider that as more a liquidity induced stimulus because there have been no changes, the changes that we saw in the 2008 crisis. I still continue to believe, and I heard Philip using the terms excess profits tax, steeply progressive wealth tax, and the nations would be free to legislate their own policy. But I think every nation will have to tailor make its policy, keeping in mind where do they stand insofar as economic development is concerned. So let's take a case of the much debated opportunity that India sees by displacing any of the supply chain situations in China and emerging as a credible substitute. I can't see how India will be able to attract any form of investment just because there is an anti-Chinese movement currently, if it is. I think that China scores far ahead of India on many situations insofar as logistics, ease of doing, so on and so forth. So the only incentive that can work is by way of tax incentives. And hence, I do not rule out the possibility of government coming up with some form of tax incentives to be able to attract these mega investments. And in fact, my question to Philip is, Philip, in the equal breath, you also spoke about tax incentives. I was wondering.
Mukesh bhai, I want to pose another question to you and
Yes.
Philip both, a short one, because Philip spoke about a very important point, which so far has not been much debated at all world over, is the abysmal and pathetic allocation to healthcare maybe across the world, especially in developing countries like ours. We've just not had enough focus. But now if we have to increase our spend on public healthcare by say 10 times, 20 times, whatever it may be, there has to be a reallocation as well of priorities and expenses. So far, we've been talking about some 10 trillion or whatever, a $1.5 trillion infrastructure spend and so on and so forth. We've never talked about that on the public healthcare front, Mukesh bhai. Do you see a complete reprioritization on that front, Mukesh bhai?
Well, if your question is logical, and the logical answer to that is yes, there should be reallocation. But the question before the government would be, how do they achieve this reallocation? If you just look at the last 2 decades, there have been scores of reports with the government on reallocation simply from the defense and the military spends to the health spends, but the fact is that it has not happened. So the government is dealing with very, very limited resources. It has very limited ability in general, and in particular in the post-COVID area, to be able to garner more resources. I don't see any change in the government's revenue, non-tax revenue basket. As a matter of fact, I think uh, the, uh, in the post-COVID era, the government's reliance on tax revenues is going to be more than on the tax revenues. And in that situation, the only way it can be achieved is through reallocation, which requires a fairly different mindset and geopolitical challenges for India. Without that, I don't see major shifts insofar as allocation to the health sector is concerned.
Yeah, Mukesh bhai, forgive me for asking this, but I can't let go of this opportunity to ask you. I think that the real billion-dollar question that many have, and I have been having for a month or two now, ever since the lockdown began, is what is going to be the projected tax collections for the year. And let's focus for a moment only on direct tax, which was between 10 and 11 lakh crore in FY 2020, as compared to the just gone financial year in March 2020. This financial year, Mukesh bhai, I know any figure that we guess may be way off the mark, but how much do you expect tax collections to fall vis-a-vis the last year, direct tax?
Arun, if you saw yesterday's post announcement media, the same question was posed to the two relevant people in the government. One was the Chief Economic Advisor, Dr. Subramaniam. Second was the Secretary, Dr. Pandey. Different answers, but both the answers, pointing to how uncertain the situation is. The Revenue Secretary made a very logical argument by saying that we delayed the date insofar as the monthly GST return filing is concerned. So there is no way on earth we will be able to assess what the GST collection would be. But he also indicated that June end would be a good time to look at the revised estimation. Chief Economic Advisor, in fact, had a more philosophical answer, and he said that we haven't even seen the bottoming out impact insofar as the economy is concerned, and hence premature for us to get into estimates such as GDP or tax collection. So I think that there is any estimate that can be given. I know that in the initial 4 weeks of lockdown, there were all forms of estimates that were floating around from 10%, 20% dip in the overall collection. But I think this could be an extremely speculative exercise to sit and budget at this point in time as to what would be the tax collection. I also feel that the June 15 advance tax installment will give an indication. The first indications could come in the September 15 advance tax, and a reasonably accurate estimation could come only in the third estimate of advance tax, which would be by the end of 2020.
Yeah, Mukesh bhai, I know that was a yeah, Philip, yeah.
Sorry, Aaron, I'm just going to, do you mind if I just add two small points to Mukesh's very interesting answer? Sure. The first point, some information came out in today's papers in the UK. The London Times, the main article is actually on the front page, don't raise taxes. Conservative MPs are trying to persuade the government not to consider raising taxes. And that's because there's been an internal treasury paper leaked suggesting that the UK may have a deficit in excess of £300 billion for this year. That would suggest that they are anticipating, I would have said probably about a 20% fall in tax revenues, it really is very hard at this stage to say, other than that it's very likely that there will be substantial drops in government revenue. There have been the several months of lockdown. There will be businesses that never recover. The other point that Mukesh mentioned was India in the global supply chain. One development I think that will probably occur is that in many countries, the government will reassess the degree to which they are reliant upon supplies from other countries. For example, in the UK, we have had a crisis over the supply of personal protective equipment, PPE, for medical staff and for staff in care homes. Much of the PPE is manufactured abroad, largely in China, and I can see the government in the future wanting to make certain that there are multiple potential sources, including sources in the UK, so that if there is disruption to the global supply chain, we are not cut off from those. The same applies, for example, to testing on the virus. We had a very small capability of testing people for virus. We've had to build up that capability very quickly. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that the global supply chain will remain in China or shift to one other country, but there may be a greater diversity of suppliers of key products, including health products.
Yep. On that note, Mukesh, could we invite Mr. Datar sir? Is there on the? Is there? Could we invite him?
Yes, we can open up the for question. I just have one question for Philip, and which was, he did speak about the steep progressive wealth tax and the excess profits tax. In the same breath, he did talk about tax incentives as well. Philip, if you were the finance minister of India, given where we are as a growth-driven emerging economy, what would your advice be? Because it is very tempting for any politician in this environment to raise the taxes and to introduce all new forms of taxes that we spoke about in this call. In fact, there was an attempt made by our association of the income tax services officer, of course, frowned upon by the politicians, but in this environment, there is always a temptation. What would be your advice for it?
Oh, it's a very simple piece of advice. There was an excellent article written by somebody called Mukesh Bhutani about 3 weeks ago on building a resilient India. I think I would read that article and follow some of the proposals that were taken out there.
Yeah, and before we move to that, I must tell that Philip is jumping on that opportunity to become the Indian finance minister. You know why? Because an Indian origin, Rishi Sunak is the UK chancellor. So Philip says that it should be a quid pro quo. Come here, Philip. Datar sir, an absolute pleasure to be hosting you. Legal, and sir, and I hope you are doing fine in Chennai.
Yes.
And look forward to hearing from you, sir.
Yes. In fact, good evening to all of you, and good evening to Mr. Philip Baker. Nice seeing you after a long time. I saw you in the Supreme Court, and we had met in London with Mr. Salve many years ago. I want to ask Mr. Philip Baker 2 questions. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. And lovely to see you again as well. Very nice to see you.
Yes. I mean, it's nice to see the new beard. That was not there before. Nice to see you. Very nice to see you. And when is your new edition coming of your book on double taxation treaties?
I thought you weren't going to ask me difficult questions.
Okay. So one question is a general question, and the other is specific. As you've been advising countries across the world, clients across the world, a candid answer from you: how far do you see foreign investors viewing Indian tax laws? Do they see them as a serious deterrent to making investments in India? What are the concerns of foreign investors when they deal with India, particularly with relation to our tax system? That's question number 1. And I think after you answer that, I'll have the next question.
I'm not certain that it's something that's really within my purview there. More it's a question of foreign businesses dealing with India, and the complexity of the tax system and the amount of time spent in dispute resolution are the big issues, and as a result of that, the uncertainty of an outcome. Businesses investing into a country are in most cases very happy to pay the taxes, but don't want to spend years finding out what the outcome of that tax issue is, and they want certainty. India has had various attempts to deal with this. At the beginning, the Authority for Advanced Ruling, for example, was a very good, very quick, very efficient way of resolving potential issues in advance. But as it became more used, it became slower. Other dispute resolution procedures that have been introduced in India have tried to resolve that. Things have unquestionably improved. For example, the ability to get APAs has become much, much better. And this is true not just of India, it's true of all countries around the world. Businesses want certainty, and they want to resolve their tax issues as rapidly as possible.
Yes, the second question is very topical and quite controversial in India at the moment. As Mukesh and Arun know, that we just had a equalization levy, which has been vastly expanded in this budget, in this Finance Act 2020, and it was unexpected. And it has really cast the nest wide, and a lot of e-commerce operators in the UK and the US are going to be liable to Indian tax. Now, there are two questions arising here. One is that there is a view that it is basically in pith and substance an income tax, though disguised or labeled as a transaction tax. Now, the consequence is it possible for a country to use its domestic laws to circumvent its treaty obligations? If it does, then what are the remedies? For example, what are the remedies to a UK e-commerce operator when faced with such a levy? Can he do something in the UK courts, or is there any other international forum where he can question this kind of levy? Because the validity of it will be tested in Indian courts, but for the UK commerce operator, what does he do when faced with such a levy? He has to comply with Indian tax laws and so on. It's going to be a headache for him. So how does he resolve his problem?
Well, there's quite a number of aspects to that question. First aspect is many of these unilateral measures taken by governments to deal with the digital economy, like the equalization tax, like the UK digital services tax. It's been said by the governments that they would be replaced if there was a global solution to digital taxation. And that goes back to the discussion earlier as to whether the OECD is likely to get international consensus for the BEPS 2 proposals, Pillar 1, Pillar 2, later this year. And I've expressed doubts about that. So I think these unilateral measures are going to be around for some time. And if they're going to be around, then maybe the answer is not to say, well, let's try to find a global solution as an alternative, but let's see what we can do to ensure that these taxes don't result in an excessive burden on particular businesses. It's very clear that these are taxes, they're not taxes on profits. They're taxes on turnover, and so they can fall heavily on a business that actually has a very low rate of return. And so it's important that in the design of these taxes, two things are important. One of them, that even though they are flat taxes, they nevertheless do take into account the particular circumstances. We've seen, for example, in COVID, some internet-based businesses have done very, very well indeed. Some are totally static. They have no business whatsoever. Though to an extent, a flat tax on turnover takes account of the level of turnover, it doesn't take account of the profitability of the businesses. So the design of the taxes could be improved. Secondly, we could do what we have done with regard, for example, to banking taxes, and that is develop bilateral solutions to ensure that we avoid double taxation. And that involves governments saying, these taxes are here to stay, or at least for a number of years. And it's important that we try to do something, which is not what the OECD is pushing at the moment, but governments might very well try to bilaterally avoid the burden there. As to governments circumventing tax treaties, tax treaties apply to particular categories of taxes, to income and taxes on capital gains, sometimes taxes on capital, and to substantially similar taxes. And I saw there was a comment about substantially similar taxes. If governments design taxes that are not substantially similar, that they're not aimed at profits, then they're not within the scope of a tax treaty. And governments may deliberately do that because they're not happy at the way in which existing treaties are operating. But my response would be that in those circumstances, it's important that governments take other measures to ensure that they don't impose an excessive burden on the businesses and drive them away from a country, or fundamentally undermine the future of those businesses. And the answer to that may be a separate pattern of treaties dealing with these special taxes. That, I think, is what I would be recommending to governments. Don't try to wait for a global solution from the OECD. Take measures bilaterally to avoid excess burdens.
Datta, sir,
Can I
put a question? Sir, can I put a question to you, sir? And just
to me?
Yeah.
Okay.
The courts have not been functioning for the last couple of months. The courts, tribunals, NCLTs, almost everything is shut, and we do not know when they will reopen, how they will reopen. So it's definitely affected the judicial delivery system, which is one of the pillars of a democracy. So and also the economy. Datta, any comments, any advice on how we should go about it on the judicial side? Because right now it's the screen is blank.
Yes. Actually, I'm working on an article on that. I personally feel that India is a large country. We have 28 states and 1.3 billion people, and not the entire country has not been affected in the same way. So there are large parts of India which have not been affected, or which can open up without any adverse consequences. So I feel that there should be, each state, each high court must have a reopening plan at the earliest. Today we don't know when the courts are going to open, what's going to happen to the thing. And what is worse, they're talking of international taxation, but what is heartrending is that there are thousands of people who have been arrested, but whose bail applications can't be heard because the courts are closed. And that is really, really worrisome. They are minor civil matters because 90% of the cases are in the trial courts, the smaller courts, which are completely shut down. They don't have the facility of video conferencing. And I think important attention must be paid to that at the earliest. Sorry, it's outside international taxation, but I thought I'll highlight that.
Mukesh, we have another special guest. Mukesh, you have a... Yeah, Mukesh.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask a question on multilateralism. Philip, I was just trying to, and Mr. Datta can also answer this. I was just trying to look out what's a apt definition of multilateralism in the context of international relationships. It says the process of organizing relations between group of 3 or more states. But it says when you move beyond the basic quantitative aspect of multilateralism, is generally considered as comprising of 3 qualitative elements or principles that shape the character of the institution. And these principles are: number one, indivisibility of interests amongst participants; a commitment to diffuse reciprocity; and a system of dispute settlement to enforce a particular mode of behavior. Now, my question is that even if we consider that the multilateralism in the tax context is a short-term pause, where do you see multilateralism in the tax context going in the medium to long term? Do you think we'll really stick to these three important principles? And Mr. Datar can also answer this question because he's very experienced on international arbitration, particularly in the light of bilateral investment treaty. Over to you, Philip, first.
I still remain very committed to a multilateral solution to tax issues. You have to coordinate between countries on the exercise of their tax system. Otherwise, unrelieved double taxation, taxes that don't coordinate well with one another, place a high barrier, and businesses will not invest into a country if they have those barriers that they can't surmount. The real question, I think, is an architectural one, and that is, what is the right body to be leading on international taxation? I pay high regard to what the OECD has been trying to do in the context of COVID, but it is hampered by the fact that it doesn't have a clear mandate in this area. It's not an international tax organization as such. It would perhaps like to be, but it's limited in its scope of activities. It has some resources, but not it's not an international tax organization in the same that we have a World Trade Organization or a World Health Organization. I think one thing that may come out of this crisis is the need for a world tax organization. As Mukesh, you know, and Arun knows, I am very strongly committed to the UN as the only truly international body, but not the UN Committee of Experts on Taxation as they are presently constituted. That committee has a fairly narrow mandate and a narrow scope of operation. I think we need to think about increasing the role of the UN in tax matters, particularly with regard to the Sustainable Development Goals, which are the UN goals for developing countries and the rest of the world as well. And there's very little discussion about the SNGs and taxation. There are also a number of other major crises that are just around the corner for the world and that have tax aspects to them, and no one's particularly looking at them. One of them, we haven't focused at all on the question of global warming, the next massive threat that the world is facing. And that has a tax aspect. How do we use taxes, environmental taxes? And we should be feeding that into our discussions now. So I still believe very much in a multilateral solution there, but I think it has to be achieved through a body like the UN, working towards a world tax organization.
Yeah, Datta sir, just 1 second, Datta sir. We also have, one of the most respected former regulators, Mr. Akhilesh Ranjan, former CBDT member, who was India's face, on BEPS tax policy. He's on the call. I would love to have the benefit of his wisdom. Akhilesh sir, could you please unmute and the audio and video, and please, maybe just give your thoughts, on how India should be responding, how global tax policy should be responding. Akhilesh sir, if you could hear me, please. Yeah, and thanks so much, sir. Pleasure to be seeing you.
Hello, Akhilesh. How are you? Nice to see you again.
Very well. How are you, Dr. Baker?
Very good. Lovely to see you.
Right, same here. Yes, I was hoping to spend some very nice, relaxed time and just listening to you people say a lot of good things, and but trust Arun Anandgiri to rope me in. So I think it's uh, an extremely important area in which I have some very interesting views from Dr. Baker. I happen to share your views entirely, Dr. Baker. I think multilateralism is the answer as to this new world. Um, I don't think countries can continue to close their borders. I don't think countries can really get along by just saying that we are working for ourselves. Uh, and tax in particular, if you see the new types of business models and the new types of taxation models, then I think multilateralism has to be there. Um, that contains all the three aspects which Mukesh Bhutani talked about, and those are the three pillars of a multilateral approach to tax policy. So there has to be a dispute resolution system. There has to be a commonality in the approach and in the share. So those are essential, and I think the world is moving towards even those shared concerns. There are issues on dispute resolution. Again, some countries, particularly, I would say that India has a particularly bad record on dispute resolution. I think we need so countries need to do more about that. But I think that's the way forward. So in this new world, then I think the other idea that I really agree with Dr. Baker is that these digital taxes, I think, are here to stay. I do not also see a real consensus emerging. Now, if the US has already, in a way, backed out of the process, when they say that they can accept the new solution only as a safe harbor, but are not willing to depart from the arm's length principle, they're not willing to change the nexus rules of the treaty, then I think where is the consensus internationally? And if there's no consensus in the way that the G20 meant, then I think countries will continue to have their own unilateral measures continuing. Then the new challenge will be to harmonize these different individual digital taxes and come to some sort of a model where, firstly, that they're not excessive, and that they leave scope for bilateral talks and negotiations and understandings. I think that is something which countries should come down to. Those are my initial reactions, and thank you for
Mukesh bhai, you want to just put a question or two to Akhilesh sir?
No, I think he summarized it very well. I think it's heartening. No, I completely understand the compulsions. When you are a senior most civil servant, you're bound by the larger political mandate. But two things that he has been consistent about in the past few months that we have spoken is his view on unilateral measures, the degree such unilateral measures, and more importantly, the dispute resolution. Interestingly, sir, I have heard this comment now even from your colleagues at the policy level that it's time for India to consider dispute resolution. Of course, these are very, very guarded comments in the sense everyone is speaking in their personal capacity because the official view of the government seems to be what it has consistently held, but it's certainly heartening to hear that.
Yeah, thanks, Akhilesh. So I think we also have, we have a lot of luminaries on this call. One of them, I'll request if he could post, if he could just speak for our benefit. Jefferson Vanderwerk, a former OECD head of transfer pricing and tax treaties project. Jefferson, if you're there, would be wonderful, Jeff, to hear from you. Would be great to hear from you, Jeff.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Jeff.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, hi, Philip. Hi, Arun, and everyone else.
Hi, Jeff.
I won't go on video because it's very early in the morning here for me, so I'll just speak very, very briefly. I actually wanted to ask Philip a question about the likelihood of a sort of partial agreement in October at the OECD Inclusive Framework meeting. You know, the U.S., as Philip said, will be in a difficult position for agreeing to much of anything, except perhaps Pillar 2, which, as everyone knows, is the global minimum tax proposal. And the US already has at least part of what Pillar 2 appears to be designed to include, which is an income inclusion rule. In the US, they call it the GILTI regime. Is it possible, Philip, do you think that the inclusive framework will agree to proceed with Pillar 2 and defer further discussion or agreement on Pillar 1 to, you know, the next calendar year, 2021, you know, that to me looks like a possibility, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, Jeff, it's a very, very good question, and I don't know the answer to that. I'm not in the room in these discussions. Your former colleagues at the OECD are probably in a better position to answer that. My impression is that for a number of countries, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 are a package. And if they agree to only have Pillar 2 now, Pillar 1 may never occur. And so the only way of getting this solution to the excess rents, shall we say, that are being earned and that Pillar 1 is aiming to tap into and then to allocate to the market countries, is to have it put forward as a package. So I would have thought that there are countries that would be disinclined to support a solution that separated off the two pillars, unless, for example, there was, you know, an agreement on Pillar 2 and an agreement in principle to come to a conclusion on Pillar 1 within a short period of time. But I can't see how, in the period of a US election, that is possible. One point about this work on digitalization, it does seem to me that there may be a possibility for taking bits of it step by step and essentially saying, well, we are all agreed on, for example, certain elements of the design of Pillar 2. Let us see whether we can turn towards drafting some of the wording that would be necessary to implement this when there is a political agreement, rather than stalling everything or waiting until into perhaps next year, late next year, before there's a political agreement, and then starting to do some drafting. But Jeff, you're in a better position because of your previous role at the OECD to know the answers to those questions than I am.
Yeah. Jeff, any other comment at all before we move to closing the session?
Just one last thought. I think there's a lot of jumping to conclusions about sort of windfall profits in the digital sector. There's been some rumored, emerging consensus in the inclusive framework that automated digital services should be the kind of focus of reallocation under Amount A, at least in the first step. And it seems to me that, you need to wait and see if actually, any of these large digital services companies are actually earning additional profits from the, increased use of their online services. They have to make massive investments in the infrastructure necessary to provide all this online service. You know, they have these massive data centers and you know, those involve cost. And their advertising, to the extent they depend on advertising revenue, that revenue may be down because of the general economic recession. And it seems to me a bit of a rush to judgment for tax policymakers to be thinking, oh, they must be making windfall profits because everybody's online working from home. So I think it's you know, something where policymakers should proceed with caution. And,
Thanks, Jeff.
I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. Swapna, my colleague and executive editor for Taxsutra, you want to have a quick 20-second comment or question, and then we'll move for closing comments from Philip and Mukesh bhai. Swapna, unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, it was really a great conversation to hear it from such eminent people. I will thank Philip for all the insights he's given, and also Mukesh bhai. We are happy to have even Akhilesh Ranjan on this call. Okay, if there's time, I would like to ask one question actually. Where do we see the impact of means would it happen that certain industry sectors would see more impact from COVID vis-a-vis international taxation? Means probably we will see a more reinsurance payment because of the insurance payment increasing, or it may happen with some other sector. Do you see particular sector getting on the radar of tax authorities more because of COVID-19?
Philip, you want to take a quick shot there?
Yes, the impact of COVID is very varied from sector to sector, and there are clearly some areas of the economy in my country and elsewhere that are just unable to supply any services. The airline sector, for example, is one that is shedding jobs and shedding any hope of profit at the moment. So yes, it's clearly going to impact differently, and that may mean that in the period of recovery, tax policy looks differently at certain sectors to try to rebuild those that are more damaged. I have just two sort of final comments to make, if I may. One of them is, I think, and this is both of them are repeating things I've said earlier. One of them is we are still at early days there. It is difficult to know how the COVID virus is going to play out. As I said earlier, I am very worried that we are going to see a resurgence of the virus, or we haven't really seen it hitting the developing world as much as it's hit some of the countries in Western Europe and North America. And I'm petrified as to what the results of that may be. The second comment that I would make is that while we're focusing on these issues, there are certain other tax issues that must not be forgotten about. And I've highlighted particularly the issue of global warming, which is one of the huge problems just around the corner. And we've got to not take our eyes off of the need to develop tax policies that are environmentally friendly. I would also say that we also mustn't take our eyes off of tax policies that respect the rights of taxpayers. Taxpayers' rights in this should not be trampled on.
Yeah, final 20-second comments from first Datar sir. 20 seconds, 30 seconds. We are just closing. Your final comments, sir. If you could unmute Datar sir, please. Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, it's been a wonderful, wonderful to hear Mr. Philip Baker and Mukesh and all others, Mr. Ranjan as well. And I think what the main point he made, very important point, was the importance of absence of unilateral action by any country. I think that in the digital world, if India is going to propose any tax, it may be better to have an impact assessment. Which countries will this tax affect, and have a dialogue with those countries. Typically in e-commerce, better to have a dialogue with at least the G20 countries, and then decide your taxation instead of having a unilateral levy. That's my suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, Akhilesh sir, any final comments, sir? If you could unmute, sir, please.
No, not really. I mean, but I think.
But if you were still in finance ministry, sir, let me put you on the block. If you were still in finance ministry right now, what tax policy would you be writing to address this situation?
I think one has to just aim at a very stable, which can be demonstrated to be stable tax policy, a liberal and a reasonable tax structure, which remains constant over a period of time, and where we try and remove uncertainties. I think that should be the thrust. I don't think we need to talk about incentives for different sectors. I don't think we need to talk about probably raising taxes for the richer people. I mean, that's something that India may not be able to stomach at this point of time. I think what we really need to have, and what business really needs, is somebody to tell them that, look, for the next 5 years, this is going to be the tax that you will pay. And if you can somehow do that, that's where all policies should be converging. We have to, as I said, revamp our litigation management systems. We have to revamp our administrative procedures, and we have to change the way we are making laws. It can't be an ad hoc pieces of legislation coming now and again as and when you are reacting to some situation, but it has to be a long-term vision, and they say that, look, I'm not concerned about what happens to aviation sector. Yes, maybe I'm all sympathy with them that they're having a bad time, but the tax can't do anything about it. I can only promise that tax will be as stable for the aviation sector as for any other sector. I think that's where we should be heading.
Yeah, and you think, sir, this is maybe the right time to reboot our tax system and maybe look at substantial elements of the direct tax code which you wrote, the report that you authored. Would you think, sir, that this would be the right time to maybe reboot the tax system?
I think so. This is the time. Let's not fiddle with the rates of taxes and things like that. Let's just look at the system as a whole. And I think this is a good time to sit down and draft a new law and come out with a stable system which can last for some time.
Thanks so much, sir. And Mukesh bhai, final word from you, Mukesh bhai. It's been a pleasure co-hosting this session with you.
Thanks, Arun. I'm picking up clues from what Philip mentioned in the context. Right. I think this topic is something that has been debated, but in the new uncertain times, this topic will assume more significance. Also, Mr. Ranjan spoke about the ad hocism in the tax policy. I think that also, in my view, infringes taxpayer rights. The timing is good because we just had an announcement on the taxpayer charter in the budget of 2020, and hopefully we will see one. But this charter is timely, and I just hope that we frame it sensibly in a manner that we are not just seen as meaning taxpayer rights and tax charter in form, but even in substance as well. I just wanted to thank everyone, Mr. Ranjan, Mr. Datar, and Philip, more importantly. Philip, I'm very tempted to make a statement that given the number of people we had, you have already beaten the TRP of Taxsutra, and you're probably comparable to the followership for a Bollywood actor in India.
Well, I had understood that we were going to dance our way out of this there. So I was all ready, actually, for the Bollywood closing.
Yeah. Stay safe. And the next time, Philip, I come to London, you keep your promise of taking me to Wembley.
No, I think the promise was to take you to Arsenal, actually, to the Emirates. But, yep, certainly.
Thanks, Datta sir. Thanks, Akhilesh.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks everyone for
thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Everyone for a patient listening. Thank you, everyone, once again. Thanks.